Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. It's an honor to have you. This is the monthly webinar for Global Innovation Institute, and I am your host, Anthony Mills. As many of you know, Global Innovation Institute is the world's leading professional certification, business accreditation, and membership association in the field of innovation. And we host a monthly webinar to really bring in the community and share new insights with the community about what's going on in the world of innovation. So it's very much our honor to have you here today on Thursday, April 14th, 2022, and joining us as participating in this webinar. Our guest today, who will be presenting to us, is Dr. Tammy L. Madsen. Now, Dr. Tammy Madsen is the W.M. Keck Foundation Chair of Strategic Management and Innovation and a former Associate Dean at the Levy School of Business at Santa Clara University in Santa Clara, California. Presently, Dr. Madsen teaches and consults in the areas of strategy, innovation, and business transformation. Her research focuses on topics such as co-innovation and ecosystem strategy, temporary advantage, industry dynamics following a shock, and growth under uncertainty. Dr. Madsen's work has received numerous awards, including from the Academy of Management's Strategic Management Division and the Gluck Best Paper Award. Her work appears in such outlets as Strategic Management Review, Strategic Management Journal, Organization Science, Journal of Management Studies, Industrial and Corporate Change, Journal of Knowledge Management, and her new book, Co-Innovation Platforms, a playbook for enabling innovation and ecosystem growth, was co-authored with David Cruikshank, Vice President of Multi-Cloud DevOps at SAP, which Tammy will be speaking with us today about. Tammy also co-authored the 4th edition of the book, Modern Competitive Strategy, with Gordon Walker, who is Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at Southern Methodist University. Presently, Dr. Madsen teaches in the MBA, Executive MBA, and Executive Development programs at Santa Clara University, where she has received more than 20 extraordinary faculty awards for her teaching, research, and service contributions, as well as the University President's Special Recognition Award. Dr. Madsen currently serves as the director of the Strategy Research Foundation's Dissertation Grant Program with the Strategic Management Society and on the Board of Advisors of Global Innovation Institute. She previously served on the Board of Governors of the Academy of Management and in a 5-year leadership role with AOM's Strategic Management Division. Dr. Madsen began her professional career as a test and evaluation engineer for the weapon control systems on the F-14 aircraft, and subsequently worked as a design engineer and program manager at the Delco Electronics Division of General Motors. Dr. Madsen holds a BS in Mechanical Engineering from University of California, Santa Barbara, an MS in Systems Management from University of Southern California, and a PhD in Strategy and Organization Management from the University of California, Los Angeles. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Madsen to our webinar today. Dr. Madsen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Anthony. I really appreciate your generous introduction. Very kind of you. So I'm looking forward to everyone. Nice to see everyone here, and thank you for attending. So I'm going to spend some time, Anthony introduced my co-author David Cruikshank, and David, as Anthony mentioned, is the VP of SAP Multi-Cloud and DevOps at SAP Labs here in Palo Alto. And our collaboration began with David's interest in co-innovation platforms. He was the director of the first co-innovation platform at Palo Alto's, SAP's Palo Alto facility. So that was the inspiration for this work. The best practices from that platform then spawned 15 additional platforms for SAP. And led us into taking a deep dive into this model and to understand it better. So I'm going to share some of those insights with you, as well as some work on platforms and ecosystems in general. So this is sort of a little bit of the landscape that we'll cover this morning. I'll talk about some general forms of platforms and ecosystems. Then we'll shift into, if you're thinking about engaging or building one of these systems, what are some starting points? What kind of problems are you trying to solve? Who are the relevant actors? What role will you play? And then what are some strategic choices around governing and orchestrating these environments? So just to start off with, this is an image from Interbrands. They publish this each year, top global 50 brands for 2020. And what struck me about this was that 14 of these are platform-based companies, right? And some of them are incredibly young. Now, if we think about a couple of anecdotes on the ecosystem side, McKinsey has said that 6 of the world's top 7 companies are ecosystem companies. And this is from a report in 2020. Accenture's also conducted a survey in 2018 of about 1,250 executives, and more than half of them said, we're going to use ecosystems to fuel innovation, to drive innovation, to expand our operations. And many of them saw ecosystems as a way to engage in innovation. That was a necessary path for them. BCG sort of also said, well, wait a minute, how interested are organizations in this ecosystem concept? How much are they paying attention? And so they did an analysis of annual reports in 2019 and found that the term was being used 13 times more frequently versus 10 years ago. Right? So those are just some anecdotes to kind of kick off the ideas about why platforms and ecosystems actually matter. And to get us started, I'd like folks in the room to enter in the chat. What's the difference between a platform and an ecosystem? What do you see as the difference between a platform and an ecosystem? So take a moment, enter that in the chat, if you will. What do you see as the difference between a platform-based business and an ecosystem? And if you're a little shy today, that's okay. We can move on. A platform definitely is a tool to engage ecosystems. We can think about as ecosystems anchored to a platform and those that are not anchored to a platform. So that is certainly one path. So let me just continue here. When we think about these platform spaces, it's about engaging individuals or organizations, enabling them to interact, connect, or innovate in ways that they previously could not. And based on the work of Gower, Cusimano, and Yaffe, these types of systems have potential for exponential increases in utility and value. So we think about 3 general forms. Transaction platforms, many of us are familiar with these. They're connecting a rider and a driver, or a property owner and a renter, but basically sort of market maker type systems. Then there's an innovation context, right? A very different focus. Here the focus is on how do we facilitate innovations by external parties, complementers to the organization, but get them to create innovations that can advance the system's core offering or the organization's core offering. So 2 examples here. Cisco has a set of innovation centers. These focus on open innovation. These are spread across Europe. And the emphasis here is on working with regional and global partners to develop technology solutions for industry pain points. Right? SAP's co-innovation platforms are the collaborations span competitors, complementers, customers, government agencies, all working together in different ways to extend the use value of SAP's core offerings. And then we have a hybrid or integrated form where organizations are doing both. So if we think about the iOS platform or Android platform, some organizations are both engaging in complementers to create apps, those are the innovations, and then they're selling those apps through the platform model, right? So a transaction piece as well. Ecosystems, I'm going to give you a little bit of a meaty definition that comes from colleagues, Jacobides, Annabelle Gower, and Sonamo. A set of actors with varying degrees of multilateral, unique complementary relationships that are not fully under high control. That's a lot of words there that's not so helpful. So let me unbundle that. If we think about the multilateral piece, it is this notion that you have, it's not about, when we think about these contexts, it's not about a whole set of partnerships that a firm has, right? The whole focus here is that if we extract one of these actors or one of these sets of players from the system, the value might deplete. So there's interdependencies that we need to sort of attend to in this system, and there's multiple direct and indirect connections with varying degrees of interdependence within the system. Why this is important is that the value created by the system is greater than the sum of the parts. And so we don't think about it just as a firm holding a portfolio of partnerships. That's not necessarily an ecosystem. We want to understand what are the interdependencies between the different actors that are engaged. And this unique complementarity, what is that? What are we talking about there? We're thinking about distinctive value creation through collaboration, right? So this is not, when we talk about complements, we think peanut butter and jelly or hummus and pita bread, but we want something more distinctive. So here's an example from a project at SAP's co-innovation platform, a dairy cooperative in the Black Forest. They wanted to figure out a way to provide greater transparency about their milk products to the end consumer. And through the platform, they engaged with a digital consultancy that had digital twin technology. And so the solution here was that each carton of milk or bottle of milk has a digital twin that includes information and data on the milk itself. So telling when it left the farm and in full journey all the way to the store shelf. A consumer can scan a QR code on that bottle of milk and capture all that data, learn sort of how long did it take that milk to get to the store, right? This was a very successful project, received a lot of media attention in Germany when it was introduced, and it came in before COVID. So once COVID hit, there was interest in understanding more about food transparency, they gained a lot more attention. And the company with the digital twin technology is creating a new platform using that technology. So the point here is that the value created by the system is greater than the sum of the parts, so keep that in mind. And two, we're focused on distinctive value creation through the complementary relationships between two or more organizations. So think about ecosystems as having two general forms. The first form, really anchored to a single platform. And so the image I'm providing on the left is Google Cloud, right? And they're working with a variety of, serving multiple industries, working with a variety of different types of organizations and technology players. So Google here is kind of orchestrating this array of actors around the cloud, right? The alternative is there's no anchor, right? There's the system isn't anchored into any one player or any one platform. And so the image on the right is the automotive ecosystem, which has morphed into a mobility ecosystem, which includes ride-sharing companies, a whole host of technology companies, software players, public organizations, utilities, all of these actors. And many of them are engaging in collaboration. So GM recently announced a collaboration with Pacific Gas and Electric, a utility company here in California, to address some issues related to electric vehicle technology. We have companies like Ford and Chrysler with an exclusive relationship with Waymo on autonomous vehicle technology. Microsoft and Ericsson are working together on a connected vehicle platform using Microsoft's cloud, Azure, and Ericsson's connected vehicle software. Ford has also partnered with Lyft and Uber for self-driving cars, and partnered with Lyft for self-driving cars, and with Uber and Lyft for data sharing. And Amazon is working with an organization called Stellantis, which has a portfolio of auto products, and they're developing a smart vehicle technology using AWS. Right, so a whole host, wide variety of types of partnerships that are emerging. We're seeing a lot of open innovation in this context. Now, why should we care about these differences? They have significant implications for the choices related to platform governance and ecosystem orchestration. So on the right-hand side, right, if you're Ford or GM, how do you navigate this space? Who influences the direction of that space, right? Who decides what direction is headed? And how does this vary across regions and countries and so on, right? So it has direct implications. I see a question where Ibrahim says we can define ecosystems containing biotic or living parts or non-living parts. Yes, and I'm going to come back to this point in a minute. So hang in there. Let me give you one example of some of the challenges that can arise when you have an ecosystem not anchored to a platform and you're not really paying attention to the complements. And so this comes from Rod Adner's work on the wide lens. And he used the example of Michelin's Pax Run Flat tire. And the Run Flat tire is a zero pressure tire that can support the weight of a car for an extended period of time. Now, Michelin introduced the innovation and a few car companies adopted, right? But the problem was that service garages or auto repair shops had no idea how to repair this tire. And as a result, you go in and get your tire fixed and they can't repair it. What do? You need your car, so you end up having those tires replaced with traditional tires. So 9 years post-introduction, there was limited market share for this innovation. How can you avoid this problem? You have to think broadly about the context in which you're operating. And that means thinking about all the different complements in the pathway between you and the end consumer, realizing the value from the innovation, right? So who are all those complements in the consumption chain, and where are the interdependencies that exist in that consumption chain, right? So you want to avoid any kind of bottleneck. And so Michelin needed to coordinate with the service garages and auto repair shops as well as car dealers to ensure that customers could realize the full value of the innovation that they created. Right. So coming back to this issue about what are the critical characteristics of vibrant platform-based ecosystems? 3 characteristics exist. One is that you're mobilizing, you want to engage many different types of actors. Why so many different types of actors? Why is that important? The diversity here matters. We want to understand, we want to sort of combine different types of knowledge, different types of resources and capabilities to create something unique, to create distinctive value. So, so you can think about companies that are combining blockchain, cloud, and food supply knowledge, food supply chain. IBM has a trust operation that is focused on that, but they're bringing together a variety of players and different technologies to create a solution. We also want to, it's not just enough to mobilize those actors, we want to enable them to interact, right? So figuring out practices that we can put in place to enable those interactions among these loosely connected actors. And this isn't just about collaborating with those actors that are most familiar to you. You also want to collaborate with those that are unfamiliar to you. And those unfamiliar to you might have distant knowledge that's not sort of really about what you're doing, but about sort of something that might advance what you're doing, right? So completely a different sort of way of thinking, if you will. And the third piece is, I should say that this enabling the interactions is all about accelerating development through those interactions. The third pillar is about facilitating joint learning. So if we want to continue to move the ecosystem forward, as Abraham said, it's sort of a living parts, they're moving parts, that it's not a static entity, then we need to figure out a way to co-evolve the actors within that system. So developing activities and processes that facilitate that joint development of their capabilities. They're sharing knowledge, they're sharing resources. Can they also then, over time, co-evolve their capabilities and continue to advance the system? So why do we care about this? Well, one, there's no higher control. Remember, these players are all outside of your organization, so you don't have a direct influence over them. And second, we want ecosystems to be generative. That is, have the repeated capacity to produce new output from a wide range of actors, right? That's critical. We don't want them to be static. We don't want them to be stuck. We want to figure out ways to continue to move them forward. So that piece of it ends up being really important. And as a result, then a platform requires processes and activities to mobilize, enable, and facilitate joint learning among this variety of actors. So if you're going down this path, where do you start? What types of things should you be thinking about? Any kind of strategic process or any kind of, I guess, first step is what problem or opportunity you're trying to solve, right? So do you need a platform, or are you a participant in an ecosystem? Because those are two very different roles. So how many of you are working in a platform-based organization? Any of those folks if you want to enter in the chat, if you're working in a platform-based organization, or if you're participating, let's say, in any kind of collaborations in your ecosystem. Pause there. Jeannie is very collaborative, working with a variety of organizations throughout the world, really. And okay, so that's sort of one, what problem are you trying to solve? What's the opportunity? What's the job to be done? Then who are the complementers and the partners, and what roles will they play? Who do you need to work with, right? Who's important to your organization? How will you move your organization forward? How will you move your ecosystem forward? What players are going to create value, and what players will extract value from the ecosystem? And then lastly, how will you design and manage the system for success? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that last piece. So this requires a mind shift, and I should say this comes from the work of a number of scholars that are working in the areas of ecosystem and platform leadership. But it is a shift from thinking about a product strategy to a shift to thinking about an ecosystem or a platform-based ecosystem strategy. So we move from resources under our control in a hierarchy to now trying to coordinate a set of resources external to the firm, right? So you're serving the role as orchestrator. We shift away from sort of internal optimization of the existing organization to facilitating all of this array of interactions of organizations that can help advance our products or services, and we can also help advance theirs. And the third piece is that we're shifting away just from a focus on pure customer value to expanding that to ecosystem value, where customer value is a subset within that space. Right? So it does require a shift in thinking within an organization, and in turn a different set of practices. So how do you design and manage the system for success? What kind of strategic choices might you make around governance, around governing the system? We talk about 5 different dimensions within the book, and each of these are sort of on a continuum, if you will, or each have different strategic tactics that one might use depending on what the strategy is for the firm, right? What strategic objectives you want to accomplish. So we think about growth paths. How can the platform stimulate and sustain growth? who gets access to your platform, who gets inside the firewall, who gets access to your API interface, all of that. What's the degree of resource openness? What kind of resources do you provide? Are you just providing digital or virtual resources? Do you also provide physical resources to the complementers to help them create innovations? And then third, you've mobilized a group to engage with you. What incentives will attract and sustain participation, and more importantly, quality participation? So how are you going to ensure that the innovations actually really matter and make a difference? And then how should value be distributed? Right? We've all heard stories about app developers feeling exploited by some of the app platforms. How can we avoid that situation? So the first governance and this mechanism is on this growth path, and this is familiar to many of us. We're all, a standard tactic is price subsidies, right? So stimulating network effects through pricing strategies. In the first illustration here is job posters for Monster.com, paying to post their jobs on the platform, and they're subsidizing the right side, which is the job seekers, right? Alibaba initially had no merchant membership fee. Taobao still does not charge a membership fee. A second mechanism is, or second tactic, is expanding into adjacent businesses or industries organically or through acquisition. So the example here is Alipay's organic expansion into wealth management. You can see a variety of services now surrounding the original sort of core of the organization. Uber's as an adjacency, as an acquisition, expanded into Postmates. And then we think about acquiring adjacent ecosystems. Facebook's acquisition of Instagram is a really good example of that, right? Now, when you think about these contexts, sustaining this volume, once you have it present, requires that you're adding value in some way, but that to maintain scalability of that network, you also have to add that value in a low variable cost way. So a company that's really good at doing this is Google, and many of us are familiar with this positive feedback loop, where we have searchers that sort of attract advertisers, and that brings ad budget in, and as this cycle repeats, Google refines its algorithm, there's learning, and there's better matching of ads to searchers, and we sort of get better search results. So we keep coming back to the platform, right? But if you take out the learning from this model, what happens? It starts to stall. It's not creating additional value for the user on an ongoing basis. It might over time become less attractive to advertisers. So what ends up being really critical here is thinking carefully about what are the underlying mechanisms that can facilitate growth, but also support scalability. And this is in the context where the focus is really on volume, expanding volume aggressively, right? So expanding the volume of advertisers and expanding the volume of searchers. In a second sort of view, we might think about it's less about a volume play and more about sustaining the quality of participation. So this is the co-innovation platform model, where we do want to engage with a large number of different players and different technologies, but it's less about being the sort of having the most users and the most compliments on the system. And in this case, we start out with a set of developers on the right-hand side, complementary actors that propose a project to the platforms. Like, we have an idea for a co-innovation project. And if that project's approved, that group is provided a set of resources, both supply side and demand side. So not just digital, but physical resources to help them, one, initiate a contract, develop a statement of work, and execute the project. That allows them to create value through co-innovation, and that value that they create for each partner, that partners capture that value, including the IP they've created in the project. They can share that value with their customers, and the platform also benefits because that value adds additional value to the platform's core services or offerings. Now, this equitable value distribution, as well as the combination of resources and capabilities provided by the platform, attracts high-quality participants, and so we see a lot of repeated engagement in co-innovation behavior. So David and I had looked at about 250 different co-innovation projects that occurred between 2008 and 2020 to try to get an understanding of, what kind of patterns are we seeing? And we repeatedly see some firms engaging 4, 5, or 6 times in co-innovation projects with the platform. The other thing that happens here is that if we're having a number of different co-innovation projects occur simultaneously, the platform facilitates interactions among co-innovation teams. So they learn from each other, they learn what each other's working on, but there also is this way of, the platform orchestrators enable interactions between people that are partners that were unconnected before. Those lead to unique intersections. So two partners coming together and like, oh, I have an idea, our technologies can meet. we previously didn't think about partnering, but now we have a new project that wasn't previously on our roadmap. So that has been a big sort of element of some of the co-innovation projects that we've seen and observed. All right, governance mechanism 2. Who gets in the door, right? So access here refers to the ability to use the technology, whereas control is about rules. How will you use it? What do we want you to do? What do we want you not to do, right? And so on the left-hand side, you see kind of a more open access where there's few or limited restrictions on use. And of course, Google Android, we think about them as having more of an open platform. Baidu's autonomous vehicle technology, their programming and app development is open, but their final project is protected. On the right-hand side, you see more curated or gated access, if you will. And of course, iOS, we think about Apple as having a bit more curated sort of mechanism or degree of access than Google in terms of app development. Nespresso requires licensees for other companies to make their machines. And then SAP's curation, the way this occurs, if a complementer wants to come into and pursue a co-innovation project, they work with, they develop a proposal, but they also need some sort of executive sponsorship. And I think this is critical in the sense that you want to ensure that the complementers are engaging in activities that align with your organization's strategic objectives, right? So it shouldn't be just some random project that someone wants to engage with. How does it align with the strategic objectives, the purpose itself of the platform or the platform owner's organization? And then just sort of, we think about this open access and closed access and control. This is just an example, a bit dated, but on the left-hand side, you see the share of app downloads for the Apple App Store and the Google Play. On the right-hand side, you see the share of app consumer spend, right? So left-hand side, we can see, look, Google's got more volume. We understand that. On the right-hand side, we're looking at Apple as potentially gaining more share of app consumer spend per app. On the degree of resource openness, this third mechanism, the idea here is thinking about a continuum from sort of more of a hands-off process to a hands-on process. And so if you're posting something on eBay, if you're a user and you want to sell something that you have at home, or sell a product, and you're having a problem posting that product, you're not going to give a call to anyone at eBay. There's no one you're going to get on the phone, right? You have a set of digital resources, toolkits, documentation that can help you do that. As we move to, so that tip is typical of transaction platforms. As we move to the right, firms might provision slightly more resources to help complementers engage and develop innovations or participate with the platform. So Apple iOS allows some complementers to get an hour or two of a technical assistance via phone, so you're actually physically talking to a person, not a bot. But at the other extreme, the fully hands-on model is the co-innovation platform model, where now the focus is providing both a fully integrated set of services, resources, and capabilities to run the system. So that starts with an IT landscape, making sure that the project has its technology needs. There's a knowledge broker within the platform. So for instance, if you come to the platform, you have a project proposal that aligns with strategic objectives, but you're missing some subject matter expertise. The knowledge broker can help assist with that. If you're midstream through a project and you realize, we need a third partner because we realize we need a particular piece of knowledge or capability, the knowledge broker can help identify who that individual is or who that party might be. The operations management team is sort of the orchestrator of this system, and they engage in all activities and play a critical role in helping partners set up their statement of work, a flexible agreement, a contract to begin work, and getting set up to sort of manage the project going forward. And then there's also a category of demo and showcase, which is really about building awareness of the solution, the co-innovative solutions that are developed from this system. So this hands-on approach provides both digital and physical resources. People are in there helping things get done. So when you're thinking about a platform model, and when you're thinking about your ecosystems that you're operating in, if there is a platform-based model there, what kind of resources would you need to provide to get those complementers engaged with you, to keep them coming back, to help them innovate? Can you do it just with digital resources? Do you need a small amount of physical resources? What makes the most sense for the context in which you're operating? This is just an example from the demo and showcase category. And so one of the beauties of the co-innovation space was this notion of we can build some physical demos for you in kind of a bricolaged way, right? So you're seeing two demonstration models here. One is a mining demonstration, and this project was aimed at zero harm mining. So two companies, Vandrico and Lumity, collaborated to develop a mine-safe smartwatch. That was their co-innovation project. And to test out that smartwatch, the demo was equipped with IoT sensors, Wi-Fi, and software, and could be controlled from a centralized control position intelligent system at a distance. The system was intended to alert a miner to any kind of hazard. So there was IoT sensors placed not just within the mine, but also on equipment, because this is big, heavy equipment, and sometimes it breaks and shoots off a big piece of metal and can really harm someone. They tested this in multiple ways, and the little orange figures that you're seeing are miners within this demo itself. There's a little elevator within the demo itself, and they were able to use it to test out how quickly can we get the information to a miner that they're in harm and they need to get extracted from the mine. Right. The demo on the right is for the an oil and gas project, and this project involved Dell EMC, Pixel Velocity, MTEL, and several SAP units, their asset management and partner management groups. And the focus was replicating problems on an oil rig. So how could they do this? They integrated IoT, edge computing, machine learning to anticipate and solve problems, and the demo provided real-time situational awareness. It had the ability to act on patterns and anti-patterns of data. It really enthralled audiences, and David continues to get sort of calls from folks that are sort of, can we test out that demo again? Can we use that in the future? So the last, the fourth mechanism here is really about, well, how do we keep them coming back? How do we incent? How do we mobilize? How do we sustain participation via services? And it's sort of in the basic, in sort of most simplistic sense, make it easy, right? So don't change your access requirements on a regular basis. Don't change your control requirements on a regular basis. Make it easy to work with the platform. But also then, and we can think about direct incentives, right? So revenue generation, access to resources. But what we found was that partners were much more excited about a whole set of indirect incentives. And these involve learning opportunities, broad exposure, and exposure to sort of new ideas and things that they had not engaged with, people that they had not engaged with before. So in this case, we're seeing sort of things like not only learning from others in the collaboration process, the co-innovation process. So many organizations told us repeatedly that we refined our innovation skills by working with the platform. We enhanced our capabilities. We learned things that we did not know in the past, just about the innovation process. We also learned from other teams, right? There were spillovers in knowledge that helped inform our agenda, our strategic agenda. And there was also developing unique intersections, right? So meeting unconnected partners they had not connected with in the past, meeting those partners and developing new projects. And then lastly, particularly for smaller organizations, there was a sense of building reputational legitimacy by engaging with the platform, as well as different firms that were engaging with the platform itself. So a whole set of indirect factors here mattered quite a bit and helped to continue to sort of get this repeated co-innovation going on as an ongoing process. One example of a novel opportunity that arose through these connections is with an organization called Elephants, Rhinos, and People. And Elephants, Rhinos, and People is a nonprofit in South Africa. And their focus is on saving elephants and rhinos, right? Not surprisingly. They have a compelling stat on their site, which says in the last 60 years, about 4.5 million elephants have been killed, about 4 per hour. So it's quite alarming. And so they decided, look, we don't have the technology. How could we use certain technologies to help improve, to sort of start to deter some of this poaching? And they worked with an SAP partner to use a couple different technologies. One, geotags on animals, drones with high fidelity cameras, data from both of those entities sent to an algorithm which has artificial intelligence that does a threat assessment. That threat assessment is then sent back to the ERP team. They send another drone out, and then typically we'll send a team out to observe and find out what the issue is. When we were writing the book, there was an example they had posted on their website, and that about 8 elephants were beginning to move off the reserve in the early hours of the morning. And they got the call within 45 minutes. They were on site and within 4 hours they were able to bring all those elephants back onto the reserve. So this has changed dramatically. It's really made a huge impact. And you can think about, when you think about these co-innovation projects, we often think about, well, I'm working with somebody in cloud and we have a software, so it's all this technology. But in this case, we're seeing sort of, let's bring these very distant types of organizations' knowledge capabilities together to solve a very wicked problem. Right? And so that's part of what we're seeing in the lab, some of the, in the platforms, a lot of different diversity in terms of projects and the focus of those projects. The value creation and distribution, as I mentioned before, the goal is to provide equitable value distribution, as opposed to sort of, you don't want to get into a situation where you're exploiting the complements and they're incredibly unhappy and they're not going to return to the platform. So it's really this mindset shift of the partners are working with the platform as opposed to for the platform, right? And we can envision a number of standard ways to create and capture value. So the co-innovation platform has access fees, a nominal access fee to access all those resources for 1 year. And many of these projects are about 3 to 6 months, so you might be able to engage in 2 or 3 projects on an annual basis. And then revenue generation certainly comes from the complementary offerings that extend the use value of the platform's core. Nespresso, of course, the licensing fees and revenue generation from additional machines increases the demand for Nespresso pods. We all sort of know that. Maybe in the pandemic, many of us might have been using too many of those, right? And then iOS, the revenue share there, of course, we're familiar with the proportion of revenue that's captured by complementers and the proportion that's captured by the platform itself. Let me skip that. So let me just stop here and say, is there a sweet spot to achieving ecosystem generativity? Just keep in mind 3 critical activities: mobilizing, getting those different actors to engage, enabling the interactions, some kind of processes or activities to make sure that they're connecting and have the opportunity to learn from one another, and then facilitating that ongoing learning and capability developments through co-evolution of those capabilities over time, right? And what's important here is that value creation isn't really just about the individual actors, it's about the interactions, right? So focusing on how you can enable and support healthy, productive interactions among these organizations. The governance process involves sort of 5 different categories, as I just talked about. But these might vary in depending on what your strategic objectives are, what problem you want to solve. Well, that's going to influence how much access you provide, what type of resources you provide, what type of growth tactics you use, how big you want to be, those kinds of things, right? So we think about these processes, these governance mechanisms, as sort of creating this self-reinforcing feedback loop that I talked about that promotes ecosystem growth. And this issue about working with versus working for, I think, is really critical, right? So we want to avoid the notion that any kind of platform owner or sponsor would exploit complements. Instead, we want to ensure that we're working with you. We're not sort of just trying to use you to help us. So let me stop there and ask the audience, are there other topics or themes, questions that you have, because we've been here for about 35, 40 minutes, questions that you have through about the ideas here? So Anthony is asking about politics. So you mean organizational politics? Do you want to expand?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I know in a lot of the ecosystems, like you were saying, first of all, it's important to feel like you're working with and not for, that it's really more like a community than you're being used and maybe abused. But a couple of things. I mean, once, I think about when you look at value webs and you look at how organizations interact, it's usually one party holds the power. Okay, it's about power, right? And there's power balances, right? And so, it's like, if I'm Apple or I'm Google, I have a lot of power and I can exercise a lot of influence and sway over this ecosystem that, little companies can't. And so, part of it is how much does that power, is that a part of these ecosystems? And then, sometimes companies can get other companies, almost like a union, to join with them and try to, sway activities and decisions, or, even lawsuits, and stuff like. So there's these, I guess, these sort of dynamics and relationships that can go on that aren't always healthy. So I didn't know, if you had any thoughts on that or what your experience was there.
Yeah, and I would say that I recommend reading that I would have is there's a book by Annabelle Gower, Michael Cusimano, and Yaffe, and I'm forgetting Yaffe's first name right now, called The Business of Platforms, where they're sort of taking it, they are expanding on some of the ideas about tipping and coring and sort of, when does a platform dominate? When is there only sort of one, right? But if we think about just the app space, right, what options do you have as a complementer? Do you want to design apps just for Google? Yeah, that's high volume, right? Do you want to design for Apple? Yeah, that's high volume. And so to some extent, the power of those two organizations in their platforms kind of constrains choices for the app developers, right? So when we think about the point that you make about sort of some of these organizations collaborating together to ensure and protect sort of the evolution of technology, right? Or the platform's presence, or antitrust issues related to platform governance and how we're expanding platforms. Those are powerful mechanisms there. So how much of that is influencing actions by app developers to come into the play? How much of that is influencing the directions of these ecosystems, right? So if we have, the 5 tech players that we've seen talking to in DC several times, how much is that influencing the direction of each of those ecosystems that they're engaging with, right? Does that influence the type of contracts they receive, government contracts in particular, right? So I think there are politics. It's not an area that I've explored in great detail, but I do think there are critical issues here. Who are the power players in that context? And when we think about kind of platform-based ecosystems, we can think about those that are sort of dominant, right? Apple, Google, et cetera, these big, large players. But most of us aren't in those firms. Most of us are working in smaller entities dealing with an ecosystem where it's not anchored to any one platform, right? And in those contexts, I think then the question becomes, your understanding what problem you're trying to solve ends up being the most critical, because it will dictate who you interact with, but also, who you're going to pay attention to, right? Who you need to influence, who you have to sort of collaborate with, who you're going to try to influence. And the challenge in any of these spaces, of course, is that you don't control those external actors to your firm, and yet they're vital to moving your organization forward. And so it does require this mind shift. It's not just the same as, creating a product and moving it out and shipping it off to your customer. You have to think in a different way about what are the key activities. It's resource orchestration, it's facilitating those interactions. And the other part, when we think about the co-innovation platform, it's really about the quality of participation, whereas others are about the volume of participants. These are tactics for each of these are very, very different, and they're going to have different types of power plays, right? So we know SAP is a very large multinational organization, so it is attractive for a young firm to come in and say, I would love to engage in a co-innovation project. And they received more, during the period of our analysis, they received a lot of proposals that they had to turn away. There wasn't, they were not running 100 projects in one facility at any given time. It was closer to 10 to 15, and sometimes smaller than that, right? So very selective. So it's a very different model. And in those contexts, then the politics might be different, right? So if we have an executive sponsor, how do we get a small organization to get that executive sponsorship within SAP if they have a great idea that aligns with the organization? Versus if you're Intel, that collaboration is going to unfold. Right. I see Brian has a question. Any ideas for building an ecosystem of foundations to free up or use greater percentages of their foundational dollars to address bigger societal challenges? Brian, do you want to expand on your topic? I do know of AWS is working, they have a platform now, innovation platform for focus on government and public agencies and helping facilitate collaborations around cloud, the struggles that those kinds of organizations are having around the cloud. I know that some of the use cases that we've examined have addressed, isolated kind of societal issues, right? Whether it's, tire wear on traffic, sort of, that's a longer discussion. But do you want to expand, Brian? That'd be great.
Yeah, I think the research shows that 95% of foundation dollars are kept in the foundation to keep the foundation going, right? To support itself. And so there's all this tremendous resources out there that could be available if they would sort of loosen up the reins a bit to use those dollars to help society. And I guess the question then is, what's an ecosystem approach that would encourage them to loosen the reins a bit? And maybe it's like the Sesame Street model, which was, there was research, I guess it was from the Department of Education, which showed that, inner city kids, preschoolers were not being educated appropriately, and so they created Sesame Street, big success. So maybe I'm answering it in one side is to generate all these potential projects that are quite specific, actually, that then you could enlist the ecosystem, which gets back to your definition, Tammy, up front. What are you working on? Maybe that's one answer, but I'm just sort of rambling here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
No, I think it's true. And so you think about this, this AWS model where they're saying, look, we have a whole sort of interface just for the government and public entities, right? So they're providing some degree of resources there to help these organizations figure out how to use the cloud, right? So the question is, well, how many resources are they providing? What are they letting loose here? Or is it just really, does it just appear that they're helping and it's really just digital and documentation and toolkits and they're not really sort of enabling that? The co-innovation platform, I think some of this speaks to the resource model, right? So to what extent do you provide resources for these organizations that don't have them, that need them, that could contribute something positive, right? So how do we engage with them? One mechanism is, look, we have a large established ecosystem, it's thriving, let's figure out a way to address one leg of that could be social. One problem we're trying to solve is social issues. How can we use AI, machine learning, cloud, et cetera, to help tackle some of these social issues? And so committing, these organizations would need to commit to sort of saying, opening up and providing resources specifically for that purpose, right? And I think that, I had given a talk to IBM, some folks at IBM a while back, and they're doing they have a lot of different projects within their whole sort of network of engaging with different types of organizations, and some of them are about taking more of a social aspect to that. But I think, Brian, as you're saying, it's not sort of the dominant piece, right? It's just a small, tiny part, and can we expand that in some way?
And Tammy, as you were talking, I had the idea, maybe it's just about, popularizing your model, right, of ecosystem development, which would be get them to think in new ways about their funds and how they allocate those, and to go them, say, if you create an ecosystem with 5 other entities, all of a sudden you can have a 10x benefit to the planet versus a 1x, and so therefore maybe it's just getting them copies of your book.
Thank you. Well, I should say too that there is, there's a whole other body of work that is about sort of like smart city ecosystems, right? And in that context, I think there's more attention to what are all the elements around that smart city ecosystem that we need to attend to. And that would include, sort of public transportation, just everything that's working in that system, but also social needs, right? And so I think there's some folks probably playing in that space I know there's I'm trying to forget what the website is for Stanford, but there's a group that really looks at the social aspect there a bit more in depth in terms of that kind of ecosystem analysis. And this one, what I've been talking about largely is organizations and firms and sort of how do we use this to create and capture value. So a little bit different model. But I do think part of it is about opening up your resource base, how much you're going to sort of allow them to, how much are you going to help them facilitate those interactions and collaborate? And can you help them do that, right? So, elephants, rhinos, and people, they didn't have the skills to develop an AI algorithm, right? So can we dedicate some resources to help them do that and look at the impact that might have? So I think more stories along these lines can also help to encourage more engagement of that nature. Thanks for the question. It's terrific.
Tammy, you mentioned like smart city ecosystems, and when I think of one like that, I think sometimes these ecosystems become huge. With maybe tens of thousands of players involved. And do we ever think in terms of ecosystems of ecosystems? Kind of break it down into sub-ecosystems, maybe?
Well, I would think, in the mobility ecosystem that I posted up, I imagine that Ford, GM, each player has a view of what what their own ecosystem looks like, right?
Right.
So for Fiat Chrysler, that might be very different. They have a whole array of partners that they were engaging with, but it might look very different than what, let's say, Tesla's doing, right? So, and we know they're working with different partners. Some of them are developing their own battery technology, let's say, for EVs. Others are partnering, with Panasonic. Tesla's partnering with Panasonic. But each of those companies might have a very different vision of what the ecosystem is. And so that big mobility ecosystem likely has smaller perceptions of what it is, but it is this large system. There are multiple interdependencies, and so you can't leave out critical parties. So if you are on the path to accelerating electric vehicle development, you want to pay attention to the grid.
Yeah,
right?
I would think, and you mentioned all these different, vendors have their own ecosystems. I'd almost think you could just lay them on top of each other like a really big Venn diagram, and there's overlaps amongst all these different ecosystems.
Yeah, and keep in mind here that the true value then comes from that distant knowledge, right? Connecting with folks that have knowledge that's not familiar to you, that you might be able to leverage that and combine it in a way that creates something unique and distinctive, right? And I think there's been organizations, particularly Apple, has been really good at this. But so then if you're thinking of your ecosystem as an industry, that's a problem, because now you've left out all the complementary actors that actually matter. And you've also left out another layer of actors that actually matter. You've kind of constrained it. So if you're just using an industry focus and you're saying, oh, my industry is my ecosystem, that's not it. The ecosystem is much broader than that. It's not just about your industry. And in any industry analysis, let's say the traditional Porter's five forces, complementers don't play a really critical role, right? So you leave out parties, if we're analyzing Intel's chipsets, Microsoft doesn't show up on their industry analysis. And
I think that's critical. The realization we have today that Michael Porter didn't have 40 years ago or 50 years ago whenever he created it. It was like, there was a very traditional industrial era mindset, and now we have a much more what I call an entrepreneurial era mindset, and we are considering a lot more players in the ecosystems than they did then. So I think you really hit a very salient point there.
Well, thank you. I think Brian has another question here about who does this in the organizations, and I'd say in this model, there was this center. It started out as a lab at SAP, as a co-innovation lab, and then morphed into this sort of platform type model. And so from there was a central location where we're going to think about this particular level of ecosystem. But there's also a whole ecosystem of partner ecosystems, and so many companies have had those for many years, and so that oftentimes the leaders of those would often fall into kind of the alliance role or biz development. At the same time, you have to think carefully about what these roles are. You don't want an alliance manager just to think, well, I just have to set up a bunch of partnerships. That's not the same thing as figuring out how do we develop this ecosystem of partners and facilitating those interactions where the value is greater than the sum of the parts. It's not just a portfolio of partnerships. So it also requires some shifting in the mindset itself about how you do this. And one of the roles that David and his team were involved in the platform that he was engaged with was really this knowledge broker role, which was really about reaching out to all these different kinds of players within the organization, but also external, to try to manage that. And I'm forgetting the name now, but there's a colleague who's been working on what are the different roles that we need for platform management, right? So it's different types of management. We're not, again, that shift in mindset slide that I showed, but different titles, different types of activities, different engagement that these organizations need to develop, right? So, yeah, M&A is sort of would fit in here as well, right?
I have another question as we start to kind of wrap things up and wind it down. You had mentioned in one of your slides that some of these ecosystems, I'm not sure if I were quoted exactly right, but some are more less curated. Some are less curated, and some are more, I guess, curated, where the ecosystem managers get more involved in managing it. I actually see that in, there's a set of platforms out there that are used for curating new open innovation partnerships, like Nine Sigma and Innocentive and Yet2. They curate these partnerships, but once the partners engage, they don't really get involved. And there's another set of platforms that are very similar, like 100% Open and Resolute Innovation, where when they curate these partnerships, they're actually very involved, like project managers and stuff like that. So I see that in that particular domain as well. And my question then is, Do you see a difference in the success rate of these different ecosystems depending on how much the ecosystem platform itself is engaged in the process?
Yes, this is a great question because it is also challenging to sort of capture that type of data. But I do believe, I think it still goes back to what problem you're trying to solve. What's the strategic objective of the platform? Because if your goal is just about volume and to build the largest network possible, then you're likely, the tactics that you're using are going to be very different than if your goal is to say, we want to focus on innovation in cloud. And that's what the focus is, and we're going to provide resources for all co-innovation projects that are addressing that particular problem, right? So if we're doing that, then we're going to provide firms resources to help with that. If we're focused fully on scalability, then our resource approach might be very different, right? We're going to try to avoid any fixed costs. We're going to try to avoid any variable cost. Let me back up. We're going to try to avoid any variable costs because we want to enhance scalability. So that means we're not going to involve human capital, right? So that pushes us more towards digital resources. So I think there are trade-offs that firms are going to make depending on what they really want to accomplish with a platform-based ecosystem, right? Is it one about innovation, and is it more about volume? Is it both? And if you're trying to do both, then we're going to see somewhere differences on the continuum, right? So it's not fully a hands-on model, but it's not fully a hands-off model, so somewhere in the middle. And then the access points might change, the access rules might change, and the control rules might change. But there also then would be differences in value capture. So we need to do more work in this space. I do have a variety of colleagues that have been using. There's a lot of data available on the app systems, right? So getting all data on Apple or Google's app plays, and that's really informing some of the empirical work in this space. But we need more empirical work that examines ecosystems in a broader sense, beyond just those types of environments.
All right. So we have one last question we'll take from Abdul Hakim for you, and we'll let that be the last question if you can address that, and then we'll wrap it up.
So the question is about, is it difficult to distinguish between development and innovation? And I think innovation needs to have impact, right? So we're thinking about there's going to be some outcome, some value will be created from that innovation. So we don't want to just create something and it sits in a room and it never sees the light of day. We like to, so innovation has impact. Development, we can think about development in a couple different ways, right? So traditional R&D, right? Big R, small d, or maybe now we're seeing, I think in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot more big D, small r, right? So a lot more development focus and less deep research perhaps. But I'd see them as being related, but I think the key piece here is that innovation should always be targeted about some impact or outcome. It should be linked to that. Right.
Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you.
You know, development feeds into the innovation, and you can do lots of development. And if you never really have impact, you never have really delivered the innovation. So the goal is to do development so that you can deliver innovation and have impact. So absolutely. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour. I just want to thank you so much, Tammy, for your time and sharing with us your research and your book and your insight and knowledge. It's extremely valuable to our community. So thank you so much. And I want to thank you to all of the participants who joined us today for joining us for this webinar. Yes, just for everyone, thank you for your questions and your engagement. We appreciate it. And we'll see you on our next webinar. Until then, have a wonderful day and take care, everyone.
Thank you, Anthony. Take care, everyone. Thanks to everyone for attending.
Yes.